Close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing on cracked, blistering ground where the air itself feels like it's burning your lungs. The sky above is stained a sickly red from volcanic ash that never seems to settle. There's no shade, no shelter, no escape. And in the distance, you hear it. The thundering footsteps of something massive, something hungry, something that evolved specifically to hunt in conditions that would kill almost everything else on the planet. This was Earth 252 million years ago, during the late Permian period, a time when our planet transformed into a literal furnace, and the creatures that ruled it were unlike anything you've ever imagined. If you're ready to journey back to when Earth became hell itself, stay with us. And if you love diving deep into prehistoric worlds, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're about to uncover secrets that most people will never know existed. The late Permian period wasn't just another chapter in Earth's history, it was the testing ground for survival itself. While the oceans were suffocating, depleted of oxygen and turning into underwater graveyards, where 96% of marine species would eventually perish, something remarkable was happening on land. The scorching temperatures, the toxic atmosphere, the relentless volcanic activity, all of it should have meant the end of terrestrial life. Instead, it became the stage for the rise of the most formidable predators the world had seen up to that point. These weren't the cold-blooded reptiles that would dominate later eras. These were Therapsids, the distant ancestors of mammals, and they possessed something revolutionary. They were warm-blooded, or at least very close to it. This gave them an unfair advantage in a world where heat management meant the difference between predator and prey. Herbivores, the killing machines of the Permian. Let's start with the apex predators, the creatures that made even the most armored herbivores think twice about venturing into open terrain. First among them was Titanophoneus, a nearly 4-meter-long killing machine that paleontologists believe could run as fast as modern wolves. Think about that for a moment. A creature the size of a small car, built like a tank, with a skull thick as stone and jaw muscles powerful enough to shatter bone, sprinting across a hellscape at speeds that would make your heart stop. Its name literally means Titanic Murderer, and it earned every syllable. What made Titanophoneus truly terrifying wasn't just its size or speed. It was the combination of both, paired with a physiology that allowed it to maintain stable body temperature and energy levels independent of the brutal environment. While other creatures had to bask in the sun or hide in whatever shade they could find, Titanophoneus was always operational, always hunting, always deadly. If you encountered one during the late Permian, your survival would depend entirely on whether it had already eaten. And given the scarcity of prey in such harsh conditions, the odds were rarely in your favor. Then there was Inostrancevia, a creature that represented the pinnacle of predatory sophistication in its time. At about 3 meters in length, but possessing a skull nearly 1 meter long, Inostrancevia was the blueprint for efficient killing. Its most distinctive features were its massive, saber-like canine teeth, precursors to the famous sabers of later Ice Age predators. But these weren't blunt, crushing instruments. They were precision weapons, evolved specifically to slice through flesh and sever major blood vessels, causing rapid blood loss and quick kills. What makes Inostrancevia particularly fascinating from an evolutionary perspective is its classification as a gorgonopsid, a group of therapsids that stood closer to mammals on the evolutionary tree than to reptiles or dinosaurs. In other words, when you look at reconstructions of Inostrancevia, you're looking at a twisted predatory shadow of your own ancient ancestry. This creature shares common ancestors with you, with every mammal alive today, except where evolution would eventually guide some Therapsids toward intelligence, social cooperation, and omnivorous adaptability. Inostrancevia lineage doubled down on aggression and hunting prowess. Evidence suggests that Inostrancevia was a strategic hunter, possessing a flexible body that allowed for bursts of speed and sudden directional changes. Its skeletal structure indicates it could maintain activity across a range of temperatures, suggesting it had at least partial warm-blooded capabilities. In the brutal ecosystem of the Permian, where every calorie counted and every hunt could be your last, this metabolic flexibility was an enormous advantage. If you heard the approaching footfalls of an Inostrancevia in the Permian twilight, you ran, and you prayed it was interested in something else. Now, if Inostrancevia represented sophisticated lethality, Rubidgea was pure, unrefined brutality made flesh. At approximately 3.3 meters long, with a massively built skull and some of the most powerful jaw muscles ever measured in a gorgonopsid, Rubidgea didn't need to be particularly fast or clever. It had something simpler, and in many ways more terrifying. It never gave up. Once Rubidgea locked its jaws onto prey, escape was essentially impossible. The fossil record tells us that this predator regularly attacked animals larger than itself, using its tremendous bite force to crush through protective armor, shatter bones, and tear victims apart piece by piece. Its thick neck provided the stability needed to violently shake prey, while its robust build allowed it to absorb impacts that would stun lighter predators. Rubidgea was the Permian equivalent of a grizzly bear crossed with a crocodile, powerful, aggressive, and absolutely relentless. Even when satiated, Rubidgea was dangerous simply because its temperament apparently didn't distinguish between hunting and territorial defense. This was a creature built for violence at every level. And then there was Antilosaurus, a therapsid so massive it redefined what apex predator meant in the Middle Permian. Reaching lengths of up to 6 meters and weighing approximately 800 kilograms, Antilosaurus was a giant among giants. Its skull alone measured over a meter in length, housing thick, bone-crushing teeth designed to pierce the toughest armor that herbivorous pariasaurs could evolve. For decades, paleontologists assumed that anything this large must have been slow and ponderous. Recent biomechanical analyses have shattered that assumption. The muscle attachment points on Antilosaurus fossils, particularly around the neck and limbs, suggest this creature was far more agile than its bulk would indicate. The thick neck muscles allowed it to swing its massive head like a medieval warhammer, delivering devastating blows that could crack ribs or break limbs before the killing bite even occurred. Imagine the ground trembling beneath you as nearly a ton of muscle, bone, and predatory instinct charges in your direction, faster than you thought possible. That wasn't a nightmare in the Permian. That was Tuesday afternoon. Not all Permian predators relied on size and strength, however. Lycaenops, at around 3 meters long, was considerably smaller than monsters like Antilosaurus or Rubidgea. But what it lacked in bulk, it more than compensated for with speed, agility, and possibly intelligence. Lycaenops possessed a slender, balanced build that allowed for rapid movement and quick directional changes. Its skull structure suggests excellent vision, and some researchers theorize it may have been partially nocturnal, hunting during the cooler evening hours when temperatures dropped from absolutely lethal to merely oppressive. If this hypothesis is correct, it adds another terrifying dimension to Permian ecology. There was no safe time of day. The massive predators hunted during daylight, and creatures like Lycaenops prowled in darkness. The fossil evidence for Lycanops indicates a predator that struck with precision, targeting vulnerable areas like the throat or underbelly rather than engaging in prolonged struggles. This was tactical hunting, the kind that requires spatial awareness, planning, and patience. In a world that often favored raw power, Lycanops proved that strategy and adaptability could carve out a successful niche even among giants. The survivors: armor, size, and stubborn persistence. But the Permian wasn't populated entirely by bloodthirsty killers. For every predator that evolved sharper teeth or faster legs, prey species evolved their own survival strategies. These weren't particularly glamorous adaptations. There were no venomous stingers or camouflage abilities. Instead, Permian herbivores bet everything on the simplest possible strategy: being too tough to kill easily. Scutosaurus exemplified this approach perfectly. At about 2.5 meters long and weighing nearly 500 kilograms, Scutosaurus was essentially a living bunker. Its entire body was covered in thick, interlocking bony plates that formed a near-impenetrable shield against all but the largest predators. These weren't decorative scales. These were structural defenses, similar to the armor on an armadillo but scaled up to protect an animal the size of a rhinoceros. Scutosaurus didn't run from threats. It couldn't, really. Its squat, heavy build made speed impossible. Instead, when confronted by a predator, Scutosaurus would lower its heavily reinforced skull and charge, using its rock-hard head as a battering ram. For smaller or mid-sized gorgonopsids, attacking a Scutosaurus was a cost-benefit calculation that rarely made sense. The energy expended trying to flip or crack open this mobile fortress usually exceeded the caloric value of the meal. Scutosaurus didn't win through offense. It won by simply refusing to lose, by making itself more trouble than it was worth. In evolutionary terms, this was remarkably successful. Scutosaurus and its relatives persisted for millions of years in one of the harshest environments Earth has ever produced. Related to Scutosaurus was Pariasaurus, another armored herbivore but with an even more bizarre appearance. At roughly 3 meters long and weighing about a ton, Pariasaurus had a broader, flatter head that gave it an almost alien profile. Its armor was less refined than Scutosaurus, but no less effective at discouraging casual predation. What's particularly interesting about Pariasaurus is evidence suggesting it used its thick skull for intraspecific combat, head-butting rivals during mating season or territorial disputes. The incredible thickness of the skull and the robust neck vertebrae support this interpretation. Like Scutosaurus, Pariasaurus represented an evolutionary strategy that prioritized defense over all else. Speed, agility, intelligence. None of these mattered as much as simply being too heavily armored to justify an attack. It wasn't elegant, but it worked for millions of years. Then there was Moschops, a creature that looked like evolution couldn't quite decide what it wanted to create. At 2.5 meters long but weighing nearly a ton, Moschops had an unusually thick skull capable of withstanding tremendous impacts. Paleontologists believe Moschops lived in herds and engaged in ritualized headbutting competitions to establish social hierarchies, much like modern bighorn sheep or musk oxen. Despite its bulk and defensive capabilities, Moschops was remarkably non-threatening. Its body was cumbersome, its legs were short, and its overall appearance suggested a creature more interested in eating plants and establishing pecking orders than in any form of aggression. Interestingly, analysis of Moschops' skull cavities indicates a relatively large brain for a Permian herbivore, suggesting potential for complex social behaviors. Herd living, social hierarchies, possibly even primitive communication, These would have been significant survival advantages in a world full of solitary predators. In the brutal calculus of Permian survival, being gentle didn't mean being weak. It meant being smart enough to survive differently. Bradysaurus took the concept of defensive gigantism to its logical extreme. At over 3.5 meters long and weighing more than a ton, Bradysaurus was one of the largest parasaurs to ever exist. It had no significant offensive capabilities, no speed, no agility. Its name literally means slow lizard, which tells you everything you need to know about its lifestyle. Bradysaurus likely spent its days doing exactly two things: eating and resting. Its massive size alone made it an unappealing target for most predators. Even the largest Gorgonopsids would think twice before attacking a fully grown Bradysaurus, simply because bringing down something that large and well-armored required an enormous expenditure of energy and carried significant injury risk. Bradysaurus was one of the last of the great parasaurs before the group went extinct at the end of the Permian. Its disappearance marked a significant ecological shift. The age of massive, heavily armored herbivores was ending. The future belonged to lighter, more agile creatures that could adapt quickly to changing conditions. When insects were monsters, the Carboniferous period. But to truly understand how remarkable the Permian predators were, we need to step even further back in time, to the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 to 350 million years ago. This was a world so alien, so fundamentally different from both the Permian and modern Earth, that it might as well have been another planet. The Carboniferous was the age of plants. Massive forests of tree ferns, club mosses, and horsetails stretched across vast swamplands, some growing over 30 meters tall. The air was thick with moisture, and oxygen levels fluctuated between 30 to 35%, significantly higher than today's 21%. This oxygen-rich atmosphere had a profound effect on animal life, particularly on arthropods. Insects and their relatives grew to absolutely enormous sizes, creating an ecosystem where the line between insect and monster became uncomfortably blurred. Paleontoptera were among the earliest giants, with wingspans reaching 40 to 55 centimeters. These primitive insects had thin, transparent wings with vein patterns that resembled leaves, possibly serving as camouflage. Unlike many later Carboniferous creatures, Paleontoptera were relatively harmless, feeding on plant sap through elongated mouthparts. What made them remarkable was their wing structure. They possessed small auxiliary wings near the front of their bodies, giving them the appearance of having 6 wings total, a feature found only in the most ancient insect lineages. Paleontoptera represented the beginning of the Age of Giants, a gentle introduction to an ecosystem where being small was increasingly dangerous. Pulmonoscorpius brought the terror back to ground level. This was one of the first giant scorpions to live entirely on land, reaching lengths of up to 70 centimeters. Its claws were the size of human hands. Its tail curved menacingly, ending in a venomous stinger sharp enough to pierce the toughest exoskeletons of the time. Pulmonoscorpius hunted small amphibians, insects, and early reptiles, using its armored body for protection and its book lungs for efficient respiration in the humid Carboniferous air. If you were a small creature navigating the Carboniferous forest floor, Pulmonoscorpius was your worst nightmare. It could hide beneath decaying vegetation, waiting with predatory patience, then strike with devastating speed. The venom likely wasn't lethal to larger creatures, but to prey of appropriate size, it was a death sentence. And then there was Meganeura, the giant dragonfly that ruled Carboniferous skies like a feathered raptor that wouldn't evolve for another 100 million years. With a wingspan of approximately 70 centimeters, Meganeura was the size of a crow but faster and more maneuverable than any bird. Its enormous compound eyes provided nearly 360-degree vision, detecting the slightest movement from incredible distances. Its long, slender wings allowed for rapid directional changes and sustained high-speed flight. Meganeura likely employed multiple hunting strategies: high-speed diving attacks from above, slow stalking patrols searching for movement, and opportunistic ambushes near water sources where prey was concentrated. This wasn't just an oversized insect. This was an apex aerial predator, the undisputed master of its domain. Nothing else in the Carboniferous sky could match its combination of speed, agility, and visual acuity. But the true giant of the Carboniferous period walked on hundreds of legs. Arthropleura was the largest terrestrial invertebrate ever discovered, reaching lengths of up to 2.6 meters and weighing approximately 50 kilograms. Its body consisted of dozens of armored segments that interlocked like overlapping roof tiles, creating a flexible yet incredibly protective exoskeleton. When Arthropleura moved through the Carboniferous undergrowth, the rustling sound could be heard from dozens of meters away, a warning to smaller creatures that something massive was approaching. Surprisingly, despite its intimidating size, Arthropleura was not a predator. It was a detritivore, feeding on decaying plant matter much like modern millipedes. It filled the ecological role of recycler, breaking down the enormous quantities of dead vegetation that accumulated in Carboniferous forests. Nevertheless, few creatures would have willingly confronted an armored arthropod longer than a tall human. Size alone commanded respect and space, regardless of dietary preferences. The Carboniferous period also hosted the Eurypterids, or sea scorpions, which ruled shallow oceans and brackish waters. Species like Jacalopterus reach lengths of 2.5 meters, making them some of the largest arthropods ever to exist. These creatures were active predators, using broad, paddle-like limbs to sweep across the seafloor, stirring up sediment and exposing hidden prey. Their large claws could grasp fish and other Eurypterids, while their robust bodies allowed them to dominate their aquatic ecosystems much as their scorpion relatives dominated land. Although Eurypterids went extinct before the Carboniferous ended, their legacy persisted in the evolutionary innovations they introduced, many of which can still be seen in modern crustaceans. The Great Dying. When everything ended, for millions of years, life on Earth flourished despite the challenges. The giant insects of the Carboniferous eventually gave way to the Therapsids of the Permian. Ecosystems adapted to changing climates. Evolution continued its endless experimentation. But all of this, every adaptation, every evolutionary innovation, every successful species was building toward a single catastrophic moment. The end Permian extinction event, known scientifically as the Permian-Triassic extinction, but more evocatively called the Great Dying. This was the closest life on Earth has ever come to complete annihilation. The warning signs began gradually, as tectonic forces pushed the continents together into the supercontinent Pangea. Global climate patterns shifted dramatically. Interior regions, far from moderating ocean influences, became increasingly arid. Seasonal variations intensified. Rainfall became unpredictable. Ecosystems that had remained stable for millions of years began experiencing stress. But these were merely tremors before the earthquake. The real catastrophe began in Siberia, where one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history was brewing. The Siberian Traps eruption wasn't a single explosive event. It was a prolonged hemorrhage of the planet itself, lasting hundreds of thousands of years and pumping unimaginable quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and methane levels skyrocketed. Global temperatures began climbing. The oceans, which had regulated Earth's climate for billions of years, started to fail in their role. As seawater warmed, it lost its ability to hold dissolved oxygen. Ocean currents, driven by temperature and salinity differences, began to weaken and eventually stopped circulating entirely. Without circulation, oxygen levels plummeted. Vast regions of the ocean turned anoxic, becoming dead zones where nothing could survive. Simultaneously, the warming seafloor began releasing frozen methane hydrates, adding even more greenhouse gas to an already overloaded atmosphere. This created a positive feedback loop. Warming released methane. Methane caused more warming, which released more methane. The planet was spiraling out of control. Other factors compounded the disaster. Some researchers point to changes in Earth's orbital parameters that may have intensified climatic extremes. Global wildfires raged across dying forests, pumping soot and smoke into already toxic skies. Possible meteorite impacts may have added to the chaos, though evidence for this remains debated. No single cause explains the magnitude of the Great Dying. Rather, it was a perfect storm of catastrophic events, each amplifying the others until the planet's environmental systems reached a breaking point. The ocean was first to collapse. Extinction rates in marine environments reached an almost incomprehensible 90 to 96%. Coral reefs, which had existed for hundreds of millions of years, were nearly wiped out entirely. Primitive fish species vanished. Marine arthropods that had dominated seafloors disappeared in geologically brief timeframes. The ocean's food web disintegrated from the bottom up, removing the foundation upon which all marine life depended. On land, the devastation was equally severe. As temperatures soared and rainfall ceased, plant life withered. Creatures that had survived for millions of years through sheer toughness now faced an enemy their armor couldn't stop. The planet became almost unrecognizable. Trees couldn't grow. Grasslands couldn't establish. The ground was bare, eroded, lifeless. The sky was filled with volcanic ash and toxic gases. Earth looked like an alien world, hostile to the very concept of life itself. But life, as it has proven time and again, is far more resilient than any single catastrophe. In small refugia, in isolated pockets where conditions remain just barely tolerable, tiny populations of organisms clung to existence. And when, after hundreds of thousands of years, the volcanic eruptions finally ceased and the climate began to stabilize, these survivors emerged to inherit a devastated but recovering world. Among the survivors were small, unassuming creatures called archosaurs. They possessed upright postures, lightweight skeletons, and better heat tolerance than the old Therapsid families. Initially, they were insignificant, occupying the lowest tiers of recovering ecosystems. But as millions of years passed and the world healed, archosaurs began expanding into ecological niches left vacant by the extinct Therapsids. From this humble archosaur lineage, something extraordinary would eventually emerge: dinosaurs. The great Therapsid predators were gone forever, but their ecological roles would be filled by even more spectacular creatures. The Great Dying teaches us two seemingly contradictory lessons. First, that life on Earth exists in a delicate balance, dependent on complex environmental systems that can be disrupted catastrophically. A seemingly stable ecosystem that has persisted for millions of years can collapse in what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink. But second, and perhaps more importantly, it teaches us that life itself is incredibly, almost incomprehensibly resilient. Even after 90% of species were annihilated, Earth recovered. New ecosystems formed. Evolution continued its work. The Triassic period dawned, bringing with it entirely new forms of life, which would eventually give rise to the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, and ultimately to the age of mammals and the emergence of humanity itself. Without the Great Dying, the evolutionary trajectory that led to mammals, primates, and eventually humans might never have occurred. The catastrophic destruction of one ecosystem created the opportunity for another to rise. Destruction, rebirth, evolution. This is the cycle our planet has repeated countless times across billions of years. And understanding this cycle, recognizing both the fragility and resilience of life, is perhaps the most important lesson the Permian period and its incredible creatures can teach us. The predators that once ruled a hellish Earth are long gone, preserved only in scattered fossils and our imaginations. But their legacy remains in every mammal alive today, in the very structure of our bones and the warm blood flowing through our veins. We are the descendants of the survivors, the inheritors of a world that has died and been reborn more times than we can count. And that makes their story our story too.